Here is the English translation of the newly added introductory section, polished to match the narrative depth and emotional resonance of the rest of the story. For nearly 40 years, Maggie's world revolved around the warm, gentle rhythm she shared with Tom. Tom was a practical, hard-working man with a pair of calloused yet comforting hands. As a senior supervisor at the machinery plant, his favorite weekend pastime was spending hours in the spacious garage, his knuckles stained with black engine oil as he meticulously disassembled and rebuilt vintage car engines. Whenever he did, the gentle-natured Maggie would don her apron, carry out a platter of freshly baked cinnamon rolls and a cup of hot tea, and lean against the garage door frame, watching him with a serene smile. Listening to the crisp clink of wrenches against metal always filled her heart with an unshakable sense of peace. The greatest regret of their lives, however, was that despite decades of marriage, they were never blessed with children to fulfill their home. Whenever she watched the neighborhood children running wild on the lawns, a shadow of longing would cross Maggie's eyes. Tom would always step up from behind, gently wrap his arms around her, and comfort her softly, saying, "It's all right, Maggie. Since we don't have children, we'll just treat each other as our children for the rest of our lives." To spare Maggie the hardship of being left helpless in her old age, Tom used the sweat of his brow over half a lifetime to proactively build a protective shield for their future. He worked tirelessly to pay off the entire mortgage on their house early and used his generous retirement benefits to weave a nearly flawless safety net for her. The autumn Tom was diagnosed with late-stage cancer, he endured the agonizing pain, holding Maggie's hand as they sat on the back terrace for a very long time. Pointing to the rows of monthly roses he had personally planted in the front yard, he forced a weak smile and whispered his final wishes. "Maggie, I might have to take the first step ahead of you, but I've arranged everything for you. This house has no debt, and there is more than enough money. No matter what happens in the future, you will be well looked after. Promise me, guard our home, and live your life in peace." Yet, Tom's meticulous planning ultimately could not withstand the cruelty of death. A few months later, Tom drew his final breath in Maggie's arms. The day he passed, it felt as though he had taken all the life and warmth of the house with him. The cozy sanctuary that once belonged to two people instantly transformed into a vast, echoing labyrinth. For the first few months, Maggie didn't even know how to cook for herself anymore. Tom had been a hearty meat eater, and she was used to preparing lavish three-course meals. Now, cooking a small bowl of pasta meant eating the same leftovers for 2 days straight. The expansive double bed remained cold and flat on the right side, completely stripped of his familiar snoring and the comforting shifting of weight whenever he turned over. Whenever night fell, the heavy silence of the massive house was broken only by the ticking of the clock, stretching the passage of time into an agonizing eternity. For 2 years following Tom's passing, Maggie's life was quiet. So quiet that it often felt cold, even suffocating. The charming single-story house she called home was the proudest achievement of her and her late husband's life together. It was entirely paid off, free of any debt. In the front yard, clusters of roses bloomed faithfully through the seasons. The back patio was pristine and inviting, and the garage remained meticulously organized. Tom had retired as a senior supervisor at a machinery plant, leaving Maggie with an excellent financial cushion, a stable corporate pension, lifelong Social Security, and a dedicated medical trust fund. Materially, she wanted for nothing. She had all the financial security a person could ask for. Yet, emotionally, Maggie possessed the exact same vulnerability shared by so many seniors living alone. She had no children of her own. With Tom gone, the sprawling house belonged to her and her alone. She woke up to mornings with no one to speak to, and returned in the evenings to a home where no light was left on. Once, in the dead of night, she suffered a sudden, agonizing bout of acute gastroenteritis. Drenched in a cold sweat, she could do nothing but clutch her bedsheets and endure the pain until dawn. The terrifying realization that she could pass away right here, and no one would know for days, became a shadow she could not shake. By nature, Maggie was gentle, dutiful, and hated conflict. She attended church every Sunday, tended to her garden daily, and met her neighbor, Shirley, for afternoon tea. It was a peaceful, orderly life, but it was perpetually clouded by a deep, unyielding loneliness. Throughout the 2 long years since Tom's funeral, her nephew Jack and his family had completely vanished from her life. There were no comforting phone calls, no holiday text messages, and not a single visit. Maggie knew well enough that Jack's family was inherently lazy, selfish, and deeply opportunistic. In a way, their absence was a relief, bringing her a sense of peace. That was until a warm, golden afternoon in early autumn, when that fragile peace was shattered forever. Maggie was kneeling in the front yard, pruning dead branches from her rose bushes, when a battered sedan rolled slowly into her driveway. Jack, his wife Kelly, and their 2 children stepped out. They approached holding a beautifully decorated sponge, cake, and a fresh bouquet of white roses, their faces wearing humble, radiant smiles. Their demeanor was absolutely flawless. Aunt Maggie, things have been so hard for us lately. I was too ashamed to even show my face, Jack stammered, his eyes welling up with tears, his voice cracking with emotion. He rushed forward, gently taking the gardening tools from Maggie's hands. Without a second thought, he knelt right into the dirt, meticulously pulling weeds and clearing dead leaves from the flower bed with quick, practiced efficiency. Kelly gently took Maggie by the arm, her eyes filled with deep concern. She began asking detailed questions about Maggie's recent sleep quality, her blood pressure, and her aching joints. She even pulled a small notebook and a pair of reading glasses from her purse, carefully writing down the names of Maggie's daily blood pressure medications and joint supplements. Later, she wrote out the schedules and warnings in large, bold letters on sticky notes, placing them prominently on the kitchen refrigerator. The 2 children were exceptionally well behaved. They called her Auntie Maggie in sweet, melodic voices and handed her a handmade card. It was a child's drawing of Maggie smiling in her rose garden, simple, innocent, and deeply touching. From that day on, rain or shine, Jack's family arrived at her doorstep precisely on time every single day. They took over every heavy, exhausting chore around the property. Jack worked under the blistering sun, hammering down loose wooden fence posts one by one, clearing out rain gutters that had been clogged for 6 months, and organizing the cramped, chaotic shed. Kelly took charge of the grocery shopping, loading her car with supplies until Maggie's refrigerator was bursting at the seams, and washed Maggie's laundry until it smelled beautifully of fresh lavender. When it came time for Maggie's annual medical checkup, they accompanied her the entire way. They stood in the long hospital lines, filled out the tedious paperwork, picked up her prescriptions, and scheduled her follow-up appointments. They handled every detail flawlessly, never letting the elderly woman lift a finger or worry about a thing. For 3 solid months, they worked tirelessly and affectionately. They never complained, and they never asked for a thing. They played the part of the devoted, loving extended family to absolute perfection. The neighbors saw everything and were green with envy. Every time they crossed paths, 70-year-old Shirley from next door would sigh with genuine admiration. "Maggie, you are so blessed," she would say. "It's a wonderful comfort to have family looking after you in your golden years, so you don't have to carry the burden all alone." Even the parish priest and the congregation praised Jack after Sunday service, calling him a shining example of gratitude and filial piety for the younger generation. For Maggie, who had been drowning in isolation, the lively warmth in her home was intoxicating. The kitchen once again smelled of simmering homemade soup, and the living room echoed with the joyful laughter of children watching television and doing homework. This feeling of being cared for, of being thought of, acted like a warm iron, completely melting away the final defenses around her heart. But with that warmth came a profound sense of guilt. Maggie felt that she was living a life of leisure, while her young relatives were exhausting themselves day after day just to care for her. She felt she owed them far too much. The breaking point came one afternoon when Kelly was washing dishes in the kitchen. She let out a heavy, accidental sigh, murmuring about how she didn't know how they would afford the children's school bus fees and dental braces the following month. The words cut straight to Maggie's heart. Unable to bear their struggle, Maggie went to her bedroom, withdrew $3,000 in cash from her savings account, and firmly pressed the bills into Kelly's hands. Jack and Kelly showered her with tears of gratitude. They put on an elaborate show of refusing the money at first, repeatedly promising that they would pay back every single cent the moment their finances improved. But the moment the door closed behind them and they were out of sight, the couple traded a look, and every trace of their gentle, loving facade instantly vanished. Only they knew the truth. 2 years of total neglect had been erased by just 3 months of acting, and it had effortlessly prompted this lonely old woman to hand over her cash. From the moment they took those bills, a cold realization solidified in their minds. Maggie was completely isolated, soft-hearted, and incredibly easy to manipulate. Her house, her savings, her monthly pension, and every single asset she owned would belong to them sooner or later. This elaborate, half-year trap of manufactured affection had only just begun. Those 3 months of flawless, suffocating devotion completely dismantled Maggie's defenses. She placed an almost childlike trust in this reunited family, genuinely viewing Jack and his family as her anchor for the uncertain final chapters of her life. The turning point arrived after a cozy Sunday dinner. The dining table was still littered with the remnants of a lovely steak dinner and dessert, the room bathed in a soft, ambient glow. Jack slowly set down his fork. A look of heavy embarrassment, distress, and even a hint of humiliation washed over his face. Crying softly, he finally voiced the request he had spent months calculating. He told Maggie that the landlord of their rented apartment was a ruthless parasite who had suddenly issued an eviction notice. They had only 3 days to pay off their back rent, or the family of 4 would be thrown onto the freezing streets. He claimed they couldn't possibly scrape together enough for a new security deposit on such short notice, let alone find a temporary place to stay. With nowhere left to turn, he looked at her with bloodshot eyes and begged her to let them stay in her guest room for just 2 or 3 months. Jack even beat his chest in a solemn vow, promising that the moment they saved enough for rent, they would leave immediately and never impose on her again. Looking at her tireless, devoted nephew and the 2 innocent children whose eyes seemed wide with terror, Maggie's gentle heart simply could not find it in her to say no. She let out a long, heavy sigh and nodded in agreement. To ensure the children were comfortable, she painstakingly prepared the largest, brightest guest bedroom in the house, fitted it with fresh, crisp linens, and cleared out more than half of her wardrobe for their clothes. She even cleared out the most accessible corner of the garage to accommodate their luggage, pouring her heart into welcoming this displaced family. Maggie truly believed she was merely performing a brief act of charity, helping her family weather a sudden storm. She had absolutely no idea that this single act of compassion was an invitation to disaster. It was the beginning of a hostile takeover, the day they would systematically dismantle her life. During the first week, Jack's family maintained a shred of boundaries. They helped with chores and kept up the illusion of being polite, grateful guests. But within a mere 2 weeks, the mask of civility and upbringing peeled away entirely, exposing the lazy, insatiable parasites beneath. They began to aggressively claim every square inch of the house. The spacious garage was soon overflowing with their broken plastic toys, old furniture, and piles of junk. They carelessly shoved aside and disorganized the sacred corner holding Tom's lifelong collection of mechanical tools and their precious family photo albums. Worse still, without a single word of permission, Jack took a toolkit to the backyard. He ruthlessly dug up and destroyed the sprawling rose and rose tree bushes that Maggie had lovingly nurtured for over a decade, the very flowers that had bloomed alongside her and Tom every summer. In their place, he erected a cheap, gaudy children's plastic slide, utterly defacing the tranquil sanctuary the elderly woman had spent a lifetime cultivating. When it came to living expenses, their calculated freeloading became shameless. The utility bills skyrocketed, doubling and tripling month after month. Groceries, meats, and household toiletries disappeared at an alarming rate. Yet, every single one of these soaring daily costs was quietly bleeding Maggie's pension and personal savings dry. Jack and Kelly refused to contribute a single dollar, comfortably bleeding the old woman's finances like ticks on a hound. Seeing that Maggie offered no resistance, Kelly decided it was time to target the crown jewels of Maggie's finances. She began a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation. Day after day, she whispered anxieties into Maggie's ear, reminding her how dangerous the world had become for seniors. She talked endlessly about sophisticated modern scams, claiming that older folks who didn't understand online banking or high-tech fraud were bound to lose everything overnight. She repeatedly pressured Maggie, insisting that her debit cards, social security accounts, and even that sacred medical trust fund should be handed over to her for safekeeping so she could properly manage the household budget. The first time Maggie gently and politely declined this overreaching demand, Kelly's sweet facade shattered. She instantly pulled away and initiated a suffocating wall of silent treatment. She stopped doing household chores, stopped asking about Maggie's health, and treated the old woman like a ghost in her own home. Cruelly, whenever Kelly cooked, she prepared exactly enough food for her own family of 4, leaving Maggie to face a cold, empty stove. This was their first trial run of emotional blackmail, and the results gave them total confidence. Maggie, paralyzed by the sudden return of her crushing loneliness and desperate for harmony, chose to weep in silence, submit, and endure. Emboldened by their success, the couple grew terrifyingly brazen. No longer satisfied with abusing her behind closed doors, they began to systematically manipulate public opinion in the community, building an armor of moral superiority to trap Maggie completely. Every Sunday after church service, Kelly would corner the priest and a group of elderly parishioners, whispering tears of exhaustion in the shadows. She completely twisted the truth, claiming that Maggie's health was failing, her mind was deteriorating, and she could no longer function independently. She painted a picture where every meal cooked, every dish washed, and every medical appointment attended was solely due to her and Jack's saintly sacrifices. She lamented that they had been forced to give up lucrative, stable jobs and sacrifice their own children's upbringing to provide 24-hour care, buckling under immense financial and mental strain. This poisonous narrative spread through the small community like a contagion. Everyone was completely fooled by the image of the saintly, self-sacrificing younger relatives. Shirley, completely deceived, repeatedly knocked on Maggie's door to lecture her. She urged Maggie to be more grateful for the family's sacrifices, telling her she shouldn't hoard her money and should use her savings to heavily subsidize Jack's family. Her words carried a stinging implication that Maggie was being selfish and cold. An invisible noose of public judgment tightened around the isolated woman. In the weeks that followed, whenever Maggie attempted to voice even the mildest, most soft-spoken objection to their destruction of her yard or their blatant financial abuse, Jack would deliver a chilling threat wrapped in the gentlest, most casual tone. Jack would pat her on the shoulder, smiling warmly as he reminded her of local tragedies. He would recount horror stories of other solitary seniors in town who had slipped in the shower or suffered a stroke, lying on the floor for days until their bodies began to decompose. Looking at her with dark, hollow eyes, Jack would smile and say, "Aunt Maggie, if we ever take the kids and pack up our things, God forbid you have a sudden dizzy spell or the power goes out. There won't be a soul here to dial 911 for you." The absolute deepest, most visceral terror of an aging soul was being weaponized against her. For the hollow promise of a warm body in the house, for the desperate hope of someone to hand her a glass of water when she was sick, Maggie repeatedly swallowed her tears and surrendered her boundaries. Within a few short months, the beautiful sanctuary built by Maggie and Tom had been entirely overrun. It was now a rent-free, lawless resort for Jack's family to exploit at will. The loving companionship had been a lie. The tireless care had been theater. Only the relentless, systematic draining of her life was completely, undeniably real. The first time Maggie gently and politely declined this overreaching demand, Kelly's sweet facade shattered into pieces instantly. She immediately initiated a suffocating wave of silent treatment, refusing to do household chores, completely stopping her attentive care, and treating Maggie as if she were sheer air in her own home. Cruelly, whenever Kelly cooked, she prepared exactly enough food for her own family of 4, leaving Maggie to face a cold stove and empty plates, deliberately isolating and neglecting the elderly woman. This was their first trial run of emotional blackmail, and the results gave them total confidence. Maggie, paralyzed by her profound fear of loneliness and desperate for companionship, ultimately chose to submit and endure in silence through her tears. Emboldened by their success, the couple grew terrifyingly brazen and ruthless. No longer satisfied with abusing her behind closed doors, they began to systematically manipulate public opinion in the community, turning moral guilt into a weapon against Maggie. Every Sunday after church service, Kelly would corner the priest and a group of elderly parishioners, whispering tears of exhaustion in the shadows. She completely twisted the truth, claiming that Maggie's health was failing, her mind was deteriorating, and she could no longer function independently, leaving every meal, every chore, and every medical appointment entirely on their shoulders. She lamented that they had been forced to give up stable, lucrative jobs and sacrifice their own children's upbringing to provide 24-hour care, buckling under immense financial and mental strain. This poisonous narrative spread through the small community like a contagion. Everyone was completely fooled by the image of the saintly, self-sacrificing younger relatives. Shirley, completely deceived, repeatedly knocked on Maggie's door to lecture her, urging her to be more grateful for the family's sacrifices. She told Maggie that she shouldn't hoard her money and should use her savings to heavily subsidize Jack's family, with her words carrying a stinging implication that Maggie was being selfish and cold. An invisible noose of public judgment tightened around the isolated woman, trapping her like a dense, heavy net. In the weeks that followed, whenever Maggie attempted to voice even the mildest, most soft-spoken objection to their destruction of her yard or their blatant financial abuse, Jack would deliver a chilling threat wrapped in the gentlest, most casual tone. Jack would pat her on the shoulder, smiling warmly as he reminded her of local tragedies, recounting horror stories of other solitary seniors in town who had slipped in the shower or suffered a stroke, lying on the floor for days until their bodies began to decompose. Looking at her with a dark, hollow smile, Jack would say, "And Maggie, if we ever take the kids and pack up our things, God forbid you have a sudden dizzy spell, or the power goes out. There won't be a soul here to dial 911 for you." The absolute deepest, most visceral terror of an aging soul was being weaponized against her by these two monsters. For the hollow promise of a warm body in the house, for the desperate hope of someone to hand her medicine when she was sick, Maggie repeatedly swallowed her tears and surrendered her boundaries. Within a few short months, the beautiful sanctuary built by Maggie and Tom had been entirely overrun, turning into a rent-free resort for Jack's family to exploit at will. The loving companionship had been a lie. The tireless care had been theater. Only the relentless, systematic draining of her life was completely, undeniably real. Jack's family had been living in Maggie's house for 6 full months, and on this day, their patience and calculated displays of affection finally reached their end. They had already mapped out every card in Maggie's hand. She was childless, isolated, inherently gentle, conflict-averse, terrified of being alone, and completely ignorant of how to defend her legal rights. Yet, she held an entirely paid-off house, a steady pension, and a substantial medical trust fund, wealthy but entirely defenseless. In their eyes, Maggie was no longer an elder deserving of gratitude and kindness. She was simply a goldmine of elderly assets waiting to be thoroughly stripped and exploited. One quiet evening, after the children finished their dinner and went back to their rooms to watch television, the spacious living room was left to just Maggie, Jack, and Kelly. With no outsiders present, they finally stopped their nauseating performance. Jack dropped the warm smile he had maintained for half a year, his expression hardening into something terrifyingly cold. Leaning back in his chair, his tone became blunt and biting. Without a shred of familial warmth, he laid out the hostile takeover they had spent months planning. He looked directly at Maggie, his sense of entitlement deeply sickening. "Aunt Maggie, you're getting up there in age, and your health is declining year by year. This house is too big and a hassle to maintain. Paying the property taxes, fixing leaks, and keeping up the yard is far too heavy a burden for you. Leaving it in your hands will only cause it to depreciate. It makes much more sense to sign the deed over to us and put the property in our names. We will handle the taxes, the repairs, and the upkeep. You can keep living here peacefully, and you won't have to worry about a thing for the rest of your life. Before Maggie could even process this, Kelly immediately chimed in, tossing an even more ravenous demand onto the table. On top of that, your monthly corporate pension and Social Security checks need to be handed over to us for safekeeping. All daily household expenses, your medical checkups, prescriptions, and physical therapy will be paid out of those funds. Later on, when you completely lose your mobility, any costs for in-home nurses or a nursing facility will come directly from your medical trust. We will take full control of your finances and map out your senior years for you. Finally, the two of them unburdened themselves of the true, darkest motive they had harbored in their hearts all along. You need to contact a lawyer as soon as possible and draw up a new, legal will, Jack said, his eyes drilling into Maggie with blatant intimidation. This house, all of your savings accounts, and your medical trust fund must be left entirely to our two children. For over 2 years, we put our own lives and careers on hold to provide 24-hour care for you, pouring our time and energy into this. Since we are the ones who will see you to your grave, it is only right that everything you own goes to our children. If you refuse to agree to these terms, if you won't sign over the house or change your will, then there's no point in us staying. We will pack up the kids and leave immediately. From that moment on, your care, your health, and your life will mean nothing to us. You can stay here and rot all by yourself. The words were cutting, calculated, and bone-chillingly cruel. The 6 months of sweet companionship, the daily care, the tender affection, it had all been a beautifully staged, deeply calculated trap from the very beginning. None of their labor had been born from familial love or gratitude. It was simply a long-term investment. Their kindness was never a gift. It was the price of admission to strip her of everything she possessed. In that single moment, Maggie's heart turned to ice, and her mind cleared entirely. She did not sleep a wink that night. Sitting alone in the pitch-black silence of her living room, she meticulously reconstructed every detail of the past 6 months. Every warm greeting, every act of assistance, every tearful complaint about their finances, every gentle touch, they were all carefully laid stepping stones of deception. They were slowly boiling her alive, hoping she wouldn't notice until it was too deathly late. When the sun rose the following morning, the fog had completely cleared from Maggie's eyes. The soft-hearted, compliant woman was gone. She refused to compromise, and she abandoned every last illusion of family warmth. While Jack and Kelly were still asleep, she decisively dialed the official number for the local senior protective services, scheduling an immediate appointment to seek legal protection. Yet an even more horrifying revelation awaited her at the agency office when the social worker pulled up the county records. Jack and Kelly were red-flagged in the system, notorious, chronic offenders known as parasitic relatives. Over the past 3 years, using the exact same playbook of manufactured devotion, they had successfully embedded themselves in the homes of 2 other vulnerable, solitary seniors. They would feign love and loyalty to earn trust, live rent-free, drain the victims' cash, and target their estates, leaving the elderly victims emotionally broken until they were forced to take legal action to evict them. They were never a family facing a sudden crisis. They were predators who hunted the isolated and the elderly, making a career out of bleeding, vulnerable souls completely dry like bloodthirsty wolves. The mountain of evidence, the criminal history, and the rigid predictability of their scam shattered the final traces of doubt in Maggie's mind. As she recalled the deep guilt she had felt and the hard-earned cash she had handed over, her hands shook with a quiet, lethal rage. She made up her mind. To hell with family loyalty, and to hell with relying on them for her old age. She would use the coldest, sharpest teeth of the law to tear these hypocrites out of her life once and for all, and make them pay for what they had done. Here is the English translation, polished to maintain the narrative tension and tailored for a mature audience by focusing on evocative imagery and smooth, dramatic pacing. When Maggie returned home, Jack and Kelly were splayed across the living room sofa with repulsive manners. The coffee table was piled high with uncleaned fast food boxes, and large, greasy stains had been smeared directly onto the genuine leather cushions. In the hallway, the children were screaming and running wild, even using crayons to deface the hardwood walls that had been Tom's absolute favorite when he was alive. Seeing Maggie walk through the door, Jack didn't even bother to lift his body. He merely squinted at her, his voice dripping with the arrogant sneer of someone who believed victory was already in his hands. So, Aunt Maggie, have you thought it over? Transferring the deed and changing the will are major steps. Let's call the lawyer today and get it over with, just to save everyone the headache. Looking at these two utterly shameless vampires, Maggie desperately suppressed the raging fire in her chest. She recalled the warning the social worker had given her. When dealing with chronic parasites like them, you must never tip your hand early. They are hardened scoundrels. The moment they realize you intend to evict them, they might maliciously destroy the property or throw a violent, stubborn tantrum. You must secure ironclad evidence of them explicitly committing extortion and illegal occupation before you can deliver the fatal blow. Maggie clenched her fists in secret. When she looked up again, she forced a look of weakness and agonizing hesitation onto her face, her voice trembling as she spoke. Jack, Kelly, transferring the property is a massive decision. I at least need time to sort through the accounts Tom left behind. Also, about the $3,000 you borrowed from me earlier, when do you plan to pay it back? If things are financially comfortable for you right now, returning that money first would at least give me some peace of mind. The moment she heard the words, pay it back, Kelly reacted as if her tail had been stepped on. She shot up from the sofa with a piercing shriek. Pay you back, you old hag. You eat our food and live under our care. We wait on you hand and foot every single day like you're our own mother, and you actually have the nerve to ask for that $3,000? Let me tell you, that $3,000 wouldn't even cover our wages. Stop playing dumb with me. If you don't hand over your debit cards and sign those transfer documents today, nobody in this house is going to live in peace. Jack stood up abruptly, stepping forward until he loomed over Maggie, using his physical size to intimidate her. His eyes turned venomous. Aunt Maggie, don't push your luck when we're trying to be nice. To be perfectly honest with you, we already broke our lease on our old apartment today. This house is now the only roof over our heads. You want to throw us out? No way in hell. If you don't cooperate, we will drag this out and wear you down day after day. You're getting old. Do you really think you can handle the stress? God forbid you accidentally slip in the bathroom one of these days. Don't blame us for not catching you. This was a naked, unadulterated threat. Staring at Jack's twisted, menacing face, Maggie didn't tremble as she once had. Instead, a cold laugh echoed in her heart, because at this very second, the phone hidden deep inside her pocket was actively recording. Every bit of Kelly's screeching rage, Jack's sinister threats, and their ugly admissions of forcibly occupying the estate and refusing to repay their debt was being captured, word for word. Fine. All right, please don't get so upset. I'll think about it some more. Faking a look of sheer terror, Maggie let her face go pale as she retreated into her bedroom, locking the door securely behind her. From the other side of the door, the smug, triumphant laughter of Jack and Kelly echoed almost immediately. Ha! The old crone just needs to be handled roughly. A little scare and she falls right into line. Tomorrow, we bring the lawyer straight here and force her to sign. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had yet another solitary, defenseless senior backed into a corner. Yet, inside the locked bedroom, Maggie swiftly plugged in her phone data cable. With a single click, she compressed and sent the 15-minute audio file, which contained crystal-clear evidence of extortion, malicious occupation, and physical threats, directly to the specialist social worker and the law firm she had urgently contacted. Furthermore, Maggie took another step that Jack's family wouldn't foresee in their wildest dreams. She contacted the town's water, electricity, and gas companies directly. Exercising her authority as the sole deed holder of the property, she requested a comprehensive, week-long, whole house utility and pipe overhaul, starting the next day. By early tomorrow morning, the entire house would be completely cut off from water, power, and gas. Since Jack's family loved freeloading without spending a single cent, and since they enjoyed living as parasites so much, Maggie was going to personally transform this cozy nest into a shell of a hellscape, one without a single drop of running water, a flicker of light, or even the ability to flush a toilet. Meanwhile, the emergency restraining order and the police cooperation dispatch, which the social worker was helping to fast-track, were already moving through the court for expedited approval. Throughout the night, Jack's family sat in the living room merrily pouring glasses of whiskey, celebrating ahead of time the million-dollar estate they believed would soon be theirs. Meanwhile, Maggie sat at the edge of her bed, quietly watching the hands of the clock spin. The retaliation of a gentle soul never required loud arguments. When the sun rose tomorrow, this 6-month-old masquerade of devotion would dissolve, leaving Jack's family with nothing but tears behind iron bars. They thought they had this week-old woman entirely at their mercy, completely unaware that Maggie had already pulled the net tight, transforming the house into a trap that would bury their boundless greed. When the sun rose tomorrow, these parasites wouldn't get a single penny. Instead, they would be thrown out onto the street, with a strict execution of the law and a well-deserved prison sentence waiting for them. The next morning, before Jack and Kelly had even opened their eyes, they were rudely shaken awake by the biting cold. A moment later, Kelly let out a sharp shriek from the bathroom. She discovered that not only was there not a single drop of water coming from the faucet, but it was also making a harsh, hollow sputtering sound. Worse still, the lights, the refrigerator, the microwave, and the entire heating system of the house had completely gone dead. Fuming with rage, Kelly stormed into the living room, pointing a finger directly at Maggie, who was sitting on the sofa, and unleashed a torrent of abuse. "You old hag, did you fail to pay the electric bill? Go buy more power right now. We need hot water, and the kids need breakfast." Jack walked over as well, his face dark and his eyes brimming with heavy intimidation. "Aunt Maggie, are you trying to play games with us? I warned you before, if you try to cross us, you're the only one who's going to suffer." Maggie sat in the unheated, freezing living room, her body wrapped tightly in the thick wool blanket Tom had gifted her during his lifetime. Facing their aggressive interrogation and vulgar insults, she didn't utter a word. She didn't even blink. She merely kept her eyes fixed calmly on the wall clock. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the piercing wail of police sirens suddenly tore through the silence of the quiet town. Immediately following the sirens, a series of urgent, heavy knocks rattled the front door. Jack's heart skipped a beat as a terrible premonition washed over him, but he steeled himself and swung the door open anyway. Standing outside were 2 burly, stern-faced police officers in uniform. Right beside them stood the specialist senior protective social worker who had assisted Maggie the day before, accompanied by a court bailiff dressed in a sharp, formal suit. Here is the polished English translation, crafted to capture the intense dramatic irony, emotional release, and legal triumph, perfectly suited for a mature audience. Jack Smith, Kelly Smith. The police officer's voice was stone-cold and unyielding as he flashed his badge. "We are here to serve you with an emergency restraining order, signed and fast-tracked by the court." The court bailiff stepped forward, slamming a document stamped with a bright red official seal hard against Jack's chest. Per the owner, Maggie Smith's presentation of ironclad audio evidence to the court, you are suspected of senior extortion, malicious property occupation, and physical threats. Effective immediately, you are ordered to vacate these premises and remain at least 100 feet away from the owner at all times. Hearing the words audio evidence, Jack and Kelly's faces instantly drained of color. Never in their wildest dreams did they imagine that the weak, fragile pushover, the woman they had ruthlessly manipulated and who barely dared to speak above a whisper, had been secretly recording their every card, their every threat. But as a chronic parasite, Jack recovered his wits quickly. He threw his body onto the ground, throwing a violent tantrum right in front of the officers, screaming at the top of his lungs. Police brutality. Where is the justice? For 6 months, we gave up our careers to wait on this solitary old woman hand and foot through rain and shine. Now that we're short on cash, she's throwing a family of 4 into the streets to become homeless. How can anyone be this heartless? Everyone, come look at this. Catching his drift instantly, Kelly grabbed their 2 children and began howling at the top of her lungs in the front yard. The piercing shrieks immediately drew the attention of the surrounding neighborhood. Shirley, the 70-year-old next-door neighbor, the parish priest, and several locals out for morning jogs rushed over to crowd around. Seeing the commotion, Shirley felt a pang of pity and couldn't help but speak up to the officers. "Officer, could there be some mistake? Jack and his wife have been incredibly devoted. I've seen them working around the house every day for the past 6 months." Seeing the neighbors gather, Jack and Kelly wailed even harder. They foolishly believed that if they could weaponize community sympathy, the police and Maggie would back down. A mistake? The social worker let out a cold, sharp laugh. Turning around to face the gathering crowd and the priest, she pulled a tablet from her briefcase, cranked the volume to its absolute maximum, and pressed play. In an instant, Kelly's shrew-like screech from the night before echoed down the entire street. "Pay you back. You old hag, you eat our food and live under our care. If you don't hand over your debit cards and sign those transfer documents today, nobody in this house is going to live in peace." Immediately following was Jack's dark, skin-crawling threat. "Old crone, don't push your luck when we're trying to be nice. God forbid you accidentally slip in the bathroom one of these days. Don't blame us for not catching you." The evidence was undeniable. Every venomous word from the recording landed like a succession of resounding slaps across Jack and Kelly's faces. The surrounding neighbors gasped in unison, their sympathetic expressions curdling instantly into shock and profound disgust. Shirley shook with pure rage, pointing a trembling finger at Jack as she hollered, "You absolute monsters. To think I defended you 2 every single day, and you were plotting to harm Maggie behind her back." The parish priest closed his eyes in deep shame, shaking his head repeatedly. "Good Lord, this is pure devilry." "Jack, Kelly." The officer wrapped his hand around the baton at his waist, staring down at the pathetic family sprawled on the ground. "The social worker has already submitted your records to the court. You have used this exact same playbook to bleed other solitary seniors dry for the past 3 years. You are blacklisted serial offenders. Now, you have exactly 10 minutes to grab your wallets and the clothes on your backs and get the hell out. If you are still within the boundaries of this property in 10 minutes, you will be arrested on the spot for felony trespass and contempt of court." Looking at the cold steel of the batons and handcuffs and feeling the blistering, contemptuous glares of their neighbors, Jack and Kelly knew their pious, devoted family facade was utterly obliterated. In this town, they were finished. Like a pair of whipped dogs, Jack slunk up from the ground, dragging a weeping Kelly and the children along. With no time to pack their belongings, they grabbed only their day packs and were escorted by the police, thoroughly humiliated, into their battered, second-hand sedan. "As for the junk and clutter you left piled in the garage," the social worker added, delivering one final, crushing blow through the open car window, "Ms. Maggie has officially retained a moving company and legal counsel. Tomorrow, everything you own will be hauled away as abandoned trash. Furthermore, the county prosecutor has officially opened a criminal case against you for extortion and the theft of the $3,000. The court summons will be arriving at your new address shortly, assuming you can even find a place to sleep. Enjoy prison." The dilapidated sedan sputtered a cloud of black smoke, fleeing in utter disgrace amidst the jeers and curses of the neighborhood. With the police and social worker departing shortly after, the crowd gradually dispersed. The quiet neighborhood street finally settled back into the serene stillness of early autumn. Maggie walked slowly out into the front yard. The rose bushes, which Jack's family had maliciously trampled and hacked away, stood bare and bruised, a painful sight. But Shirley stepped over, her eyes red as she took Maggie's hands into her own. "Maggie, I am so incredibly sorry. I was blind, saying all those foolish things to you. Tomorrow, let's go to the nursery together. We'll buy the finest saplings and plant this garden anew. Maggie offered a gentle smile, patting Shirley's hand. Turning around, she looked up at the beautiful house that belonged to her and Tom. Though the rooms inside were currently dark, without water or power, and left in a chaotic mess, the suffocating dread that had plagued her for 6 months, the terror of living with wolves, had vanished into thin air. For the first time in 2 long years, standing in that empty yard, she felt an unshakable sense of security and grounded confidence that was entirely her own. The retaliation of a gentle soul may have arrived late, but she had reclaimed her dignity, and she had successfully guarded the life's work of her departed husband. During the first week following the eviction of Jack's family, Maggie's life returned to its absolute, profound silence. But this time, the air was no longer thick with oppressive loneliness. Instead, it carried a long-awaited lightness. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the moving truck backed into the driveway right on schedule. Several burly movers hauled away the old furniture, plastic toys, and sheer junk left behind in the garage by Jack's family. Once the mountain of clutter was cleared, it revealed several labeled wooden crates tucked away in the deepest corner, Tom's most prized mechanical tools, and their family photo albums spanning decades. Though coated in thick dust, they were perfectly unharmed. Maggie fetched a clean cloth, meticulously wiping the dust from the albums piece by piece. Looking at the youthful smile of her husband in the old photographs, Maggie smiled with a profound sense of closure for the first time in 2 years. Yet, vampires like Jack and Kelly were not the type to accept defeat gracefully. On the 5th day after their eviction, while Maggie was walking to church for service, her phone rang unexpectedly with Jack's name on the screen. The voice on the other end held none of his former arrogance. Instead, Jack whimpered in a sickeningly sweet, pleading tone, laced with emotional manipulation. "Aunt Maggie, how can you be so cruel? That restraining order has made it impossible for us to even step foot in town. No apartment complex will rent to us, and the 2 kids are freezing with us in a cheap motel. I'm begging you, don't you have that $300,000 medical trust fund? You're in perfect health. You don't even need it right now. Can't you just withdraw $50,000 and lend it to us for rent and living expenses? We are the only living bloodline of the Smith family left. Are you seriously going to sit back and watch your own grandnephews beg on the streets?" Faced with Jack's shameless begging, Maggie didn't feel even a flicker of emotion. She listened calmly until he finished, then replied with freezing indifference, "Jack, that medical trust is legally restricted. From the very day it was established, I have been its sole beneficiary. Even if I never spend a single dime of it, it will be donated directly to a charitable foundation per Tom's final wishes to support elderly folks who truly have no one. As for you, the Smith family bloodline has no room for parasites who feed on the lives of the elderly. Do not call this number again. My attorney has already submitted the evidence of your harassment to the court." Here is the polished English translation, bringing the story to a powerful, emotionally satisfying conclusion for a mature audience. With that, Maggie hung up without a moment's hesitation and blocked the number permanently. A month later, the county criminal court officially called the case to trial. With the full intervention of the senior protective services social worker, combined with the clear, uninterrupted audio recording provided by Maggie and the joint courtroom testimonies of Shirley and the parish priest, the trial proceeded with remarkable smoothness. In the courtroom, the judge severely reprimanded Jack and Kelly for their heinous conduct, branding them a societal cancer that specialized in trampling the baseline of human decency. Ultimately, the court handed down its verdict for intentional extortion, malicious property occupation, and physical threats. Jack and Kelly were both sentenced to 2 years in prison, with 6 months suspended. Furthermore, they were legally mandated to pay back the stolen $3,000 to Maggie in installments through mandatory labor over the next 5 years. As for their 2 children, due to their parents' incarceration and utter lack of capability to provide care, they were taken into custody by the local child welfare agency and placed with a foster family. On the day of the sentencing, Jack and Kelly wept hysterically in the courtroom. The moment the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, they stared fixedly at Maggie sitting in the gallery, their eyes consumed by absolute terror and regret. They finally understood that the solitary, soft-hearted old woman they thought they could ruthlessly exploit and bully could utterly destroy them under the weight of the law once she steeled her heart. On a late autumn afternoon, the golden sunlight washed over the pristine, orderly house. Shirley and several parishioners from the church were kneeling in Maggie's front yard, shovels and fresh flower saplings in hand, happily helping her replant the monthly roses and climbing roses. The chaos of the children was gone, replaced by neighbors and friends who genuinely cared for Maggie's well-being. Maggie, come next spring, the roses here will definitely bloom redder and more beautiful than ever before. Shirley called out with a wide smile, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. Wearing an apron, Maggie walked slowly out of the house, holding a platter of freshly baked cinnamon rolls and a pot of steaming black tea. Looking out at the lively, vibrant yard and listening to the joyous laughter of her friends, the hollow ache in her heart, the crack once caused by profound loneliness, was finally, completely filled by this genuine, kind-hearted warmth. She no longer had deceitful younger relatives, but she had won back her true dignity, her absolute security, and the unshakable peace of her remaining years. As the autumn wind brushed past, rustling the fallen leaves, Maggie knew that if Tom could see her now, he would be immensely proud of her bravery. Here is the English translation of the epilogue, polished to deliver a deeply moving and satisfying conclusion for a mature audience. In the blink of an eye, spring arrived the following year. The snow and ice of the small town melted away, and Maggie's front yard welcomed a spectacular, breathtaking bloom. The roses and climbing roses, which the neighbors had rallied together to replant, had not only survived, they were blooming more fluidly, vibrantly, and heavily than ever before. Weighty clusters of crimson and blush blossoms bowed the branches, releasing a rich, enveloping fragrance into the air. As the inspiring story of Maggie's reclamation of her life rippled through the small town, her front yard transformed into a landmark of the community, prompting almost every passerby to stop and marvel at its beauty. Meanwhile, behind the iron bars of the county jail, Jack and Kelly were slowly choking on the bitter fruit of their own creation. The grueling physical labor and the rigid, unfeeling routine of prison life completely shattered their inherently lazy, parasitic nature. Unable to endure the brutal, high-intensity work of the prison laundry facility, Kelly's hands were perpetually covered in raw, weeping blisters, leaving her to do nothing but curl up in her cramped cell and cry in total despair each day. Jack lived in a constant state of anxiety, ostracized and intimidated by his fellow inmates. He attempted multiple times to write letters to Maggie and even tried to contact the Child Welfare Agency in a desperate bid to see his two children. However, due to the active restraining order, every single one of his letters was returned to sender unopened. The welfare agency delivered an equally devastating blow, explicitly informing him that given their heinous past crimes and the profound psychological trauma inflicted on the children, they had legally and permanently forfeited their parental rights. The children were living peacefully in a new foster home and refused any contact with them. Parasites are used to drawing blood. Once stripped of a host, they have no choice under the heavy fist of the law but to helplessly rot away. On a bright, sun-drenched afternoon, Maggie stepped into the garage for the first time in months. She had hired someone to reinforce and completely repaint the workbench that Jack's family had left in a shambles. As she lovingly wiped down each piece of Tom's most prized mechanical tools, arranging them neatly back onto the racks, her fingers brushed against a delicate, vintage tin box hidden in the very bottom drawer. Opening it, she found a yellowed, handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakably Tom's, neat, familiar, and precise. To my bravest Maggie, if you are reading this note, it means I am likely no longer by your side. Do not fear the loneliness, my love. My devotion will manifest in every brick and every tile of this house to guard you. You are so much stronger than you give yourself credit for. Go on and live bravely, my girl. Staring at the words, my girl, the tears that Maggie had suppressed for over 2 long years finally broke free without warning, splashing in heavy, rapid drops onto the paper. But this time, her tears held no trace of oppression, loneliness, or grievance. She pressed the note tightly against her heart, feeling a sudden surge of infinite, unshakable strength wash over her. Stepping out of the garage, the warm spring breeze brushed against her face, gently lifting her silver hair. Maggie took a deep, clear breath, gazed out at the sea of blooming roses filling her yard, and whispered to herself with a serene smile, "Tom, I did it. I am going to live well, better than I ever have before."